and for a while I was in a camp on the 3 Mile Bush Road, which enabled me to go home quite a bit. And when the Japanese threat had receded quite a bit, and a lot of the units were stood down, and people returned to industry and to the farms, and to of course there's into the 3rd Division, which went up into the Pacific. There was quite a change needed in some of the camps that have been built for tactical purposes. Some of these were no longer required, and newer, bigger camps were required for the consolidation which resulted. Anyway, one of the units which was in this camp was the remnants of the North Auckland Mounted Rifles, whatever number light armoured fighting vehicle regiment they were. But by this time, of course, these regiments had been equipped with General Stuart tanks, and they had more tanks than they had men, so tanks were being done up and sent back to ordnance depots. So to our delight, one morning we were asked if we'd ever had a ride in a tank, and so we accepted the offer with some glee, and the tanks rolled up the road past our place. This was quite early in the morning, but milkings had been done. Up past our farm, past the milking shed, up and turned around to make a fast run on the downhill section. And they picked up quite a pace. And I remember being able to see, as we rushed past, our cream stand with 2 cans of cream in it. And I thought, right, that's really close to the road when you get traffic rushing around like this. Of course, they were built close to the roads for the convenience of the truck drivers who had to pick up the cream. Well, these tanks wheeled into camp, roared into camp, and they wheeled into a line abreast formation, and pulled up, and we got out, and I saw one of the funniest sights you could imagine. The driver of one of these tanks was pouring cream, shoveling it out of his eyes, and the whole of the front of the tank was covered with cream. So I said to the young officer who hosted us, have you got any ammunition for these guns? And he said, why? And I said, well, if that's my old man's cream stand you're demolished, you're going to need it. But just at that moment, I looked across to the camp gates, and in through the gates came a cut down Chrysler. The farmers used to cut down old Chrysler cars and put a tray on the back of them. And our neighbour Mel Young had one of these, and on the front of it he had a hay sweep in the travelling position. In other words, the tines of the sweep which were about 8 feet long, I suppose, with steel shoes on the sharpened end of them. He swung in through the gate, and I fully expected to see him lower the sweep into the charge position and retaliate for the action of the tank. But shortly afterwards I had a summons from the chap who was in charge of our detachment, and he said, would I take Mr. Young round to our yard and give him whatever timber he needed to replace his loss. And I'm quite sure that Mel Young didn't buy any timber for about 3 years after that. When I was nearing 21, somebody said, oh, you know, you should have, before you're 21, you should take out life insurance. So I got in touch with an AMP man and was required to have a medical exam. And when the doctor finished the exam, he said to me, how would you feel about going overseas? And I said, well, yeah, I'd like that. Why? He said, well, I'm on the medical board, and I think if you made an application, you'd be okay. And so I did, but these things move pretty slowly. And when I finally got away, it was in the 15th Reinforcement. And we did our training at Papakura. From time to time I used to get called over to help out with pencil and paper on various chores. And one thing that struck me was that I was called out one day and they were going through the recruits in the draft, and they would talk to them and ask them what corps they would like to be in, and if there were any vacancies, that's where they'd be allocated to the artillery or engineers or wherever. Anyway, a young snowy-headed fellow came through, and his name was Sutcliffe. And the two officers immediately sat upright. Are you the cricketer? And of course Bert Sutcliffe got where he wanted to go on the strength of being a very good cricketer. In fact, of course, he became New Zealand's leading batsman after the war. But the sad thing was that we had a lot of 3rd Division chaps who'd come back from 3rd Division, had been manpowered out into industry and then called up again in the draft to go overseas, and some of those chaps, particularly those who've been in artillery and some of the more skilled occupations, they had to go in the infantry, which they didn't think very much of. But the most dramatic moment was when I was helping out in the orderly room, and the command was count off 200 names or whatever it was and rule the line across. So I counted off 200 names and ruled the line across, and the name below the line was John J. Stewart, he'd been called upon to lecture to the troops on some of the gases that are used in warfare. Although he was just a buck private like the rest of us. And we sailed from Wellington and called at Melbourne. I was fortunate enough that I didn't miss a meal, although the mess deck was pretty empty at times coming across the Tasman. We had an escort, but I can't remember what it was now. It was a cruiser of some sort. And we called it Melbourne, and then we called it Colombo, and we had a little run ashore at Colombo. Found it very, very interesting. We anchored out in the stream and were taken ashore on barges. And while we were there, they were starting to erect decorations. And by the time we were into the Red Sea, a few days later, peace had been declared in Europe. We anchored at Port Tewfik at the southern end of the Suez Canal, and we landed by barge, fairly large barge, and I had an early attack of jippy tummy, and distinguished myself by having to heave my body outboard, hanging onto the side rails in full view of the whole barge load. We travelled up by train through to Cairo and out to Mahdi Camp. I remember our troop deck commander was Selwyn Toogood, the radio man, and he'd been home on furlough, and he was going back for a second lot, and Egypt was a very, very interesting experience, and because the Japanese war was still going on, and plans were afoot for a brigade of New Zealanders to be sent out there, we continued with our training in Mahdi. It was in summer, of course, and we had to start very, very early in the morning with Bailey bridging. Bailey bridging was a large part of our training, because by about 11 o'clock the steel was so hot that it would burn your hands. So we were supposed to have a siesta, but you felt most comfortable if you were out playing some sort of sport instead of lying down and sweating. We had quite a short stay in Egypt. We were going to have a short stay and go straight up to join up with the division in Italy, but when the news of the Japanese surrender came through, things were upset a bit, and they put a lot of emphasis on rehabilitation and the army education units came into their own, and we had the opportunity of doing various things. One of the courses that was offered was in horse handling, and thinking that horse handling might be useful to learn. I put my name down for that, as did another chap who was a shepherd somewhere. We found to our delight that we were scheduled to go up to Jerusalem to a British Army riding school up there. But that was cancelled when it was decided that we would go up to Italy. But before we did, we went down to a British Army bridging school off the Suez Canal at Ismailia, where they had an area of water that was suitable for building quite substantial floating bridges. And while we were there, the British Pacific Fleet sailed through the canal. And I can tell you, it's quite a sight to see an aircraft carrier, see the flight deck of an aircraft carrier passing you by. We went up to Italy, a very short voyage, of course. I was in command of the engineer detachment, and it was always amused me to hear Major A and Major B and Captain C and Lieutenant D, and Sergeant Major E, and Lance Corporal Harris to report to the OC Troops Office. We landed at Toronto, which of course was where the British had demonstrated to the Japanese that Pearl Harbor was feasible. And we moved to the division's base camp at Barry. Now, Barry is a seaport.
Occurred right here in Cinnamon Gardens, again not more than half a mile from my house in Colombo.
We were at the 2NZEF advanced base in Bari, Italy, I think. And that was in fact about halfway between Toronto and the port of Bari, and it was pretty primitive. But there was a football field and enough room for us to do the things that soldiery is required to do. Army riding school up there. But that was cancelled when it was decided that we would go up to Italy. But before we did, we went down to a British Army bridging school off the Suez Canal at Ismailia, where they had an area of water that was suitable for building quite substantial floating bridges. And while we were there, the British Pacific Fleet sailed through the canal. And I can tell you, it's quite a sight to see an aircraft carrier, see the flight deck of an aircraft carrier passing you by. We went up to Italy, a very short voyage, of course. I was in command of the engineer detachment, and it was always amused me to hear Major A and Major B and Captain C and Lieutenant D, and Sergeant Major E, and Lance Corporal Harris to report to the OC Troops Office. We landed at Toronto, which of course was where the British had demonstrated to the Japanese that Pearl Harbor was feasible. And we moved to the division's base camp at Barry. Now Barry is a seaport. We were at the 2NZEF advanced base in Bari, Italy, I think. Mm-hmm. And that was, in fact, about halfway between Toronto and the port of Bari, and it was pretty primitive. But there was a football field and enough room for us to do the things that soldiery is required to do. And pretty soon we were loaded onto to a train, and I can't remember whether there were cattle trucks or not, but it took us 4 days to go from Barry up the Adriatic coast to reach Florence. And we had a good view of what systematic wrecking of a railroad looks like. Also the number of locomotives that were cast aside along the road. And when we got to Florence, we went into tents down on the banks of the Arno River, and it was pretty cold. It would have been still just before Christmas, I think, and I remember we rigged up a heating system in our tent out of ammunition boxes and a few bits of ducting that we found in the local rubbish dump. Sadly, we lost a member of our tent complement to sickness in Florence, and there I first met Peter Holmes, who was in charge of the burial detail, and I was a bearer. At the funeral, or after the funeral, I found the grave of Jill's cousin, John Carlyle, who had served with the South African Air Force, or maybe it was Rhodesian Air Force, and had been killed at Pisa. I'm not quite sure how he died. Anyway, he's buried there in Florence. We weren't in canvas too long. We moved through various buildings and participated in what must have been the last divisional parade of the 2nd Division. When the division was disbanded and we were put into the brigade formation that was to go to Italy, we moved into an old aeronautical college, and those were pretty good winter quarters. They were handy to town for leave. We got a reasonable amount of local leave. And I'm not sure how they kept us busy, but I do remember that our unit, Engineer Unit 1, a brigade guard mounting competition, to everybody's great surprise. The Brigadier Stewart stuttered quite badly, and one morning we were to parade for the Brigadier, and we smugly imagined that we were going to be complimented on winning the guard competition. However, the Brigadier was doing his round of pep talks, and we learned that we were having a marvellous trip at the expense of the taxpayers, which for most of us was quite true, that we were the most pox-ridden force in history, that we had a fair claim to being the most drunken, and that we should pull our socks up. Fortunately, his stutter rather took away some of the bite in his back. We stayed in Florence until about January, I imagine, the end of January. We had one decent leave from there, about 3 days trip down to Rome. This time everybody was busy with the Army Educational Service, trying to pick up the threads of study or embarking on new study, and the service was pretty helpful, done by correspondence. And of course people who were sitting university exams, they were well catered for too. The papers came across, and the exams were taken in pretty reasonable conditions. We had a visit also down to Pisa to see the Leaning Tower, but in general we didn't get very far. Then we had to take our vehicles and equipment down to Bari via Rome, ready to be forwarded out to Japan, and that was about a 3-day trip, I think, and meant a couple of nights out in the open. We carried, each of us carried half a bivouac tent, but I don't think that anybody bothered putting them up. We just wrapped ourselves up in the canvas and slept on the ground. I had a good view of the casino on the way down, and could picture what pretty grim the fighting must have been there. We crossed the Pennines, I suppose they are. Whatever the Italian spine of mountains is, and crossed to Foggia, and that was on the Adriatic side, and that was the site of some much publicised drainage works and improvement of farmland that Mussolini had carried out. And on down to Bari, and I remember when we got to Bari, the the roads were very frosty or icy or something, and anyway, we all made it safely, and I think we left our advance guard, including Clive Nettleton, there to accompany the gear out to Japan. And once again we travelled by train from Barry back to Florence. This time it was quite different. We were just one night on the journey. There was a marvellous series of servicing points along the way, run by the British Army, and imaginatively called feeding halts. And there we stopped, and they had restrooms, and they had, which were long rows of very public seats to sit on. We had showers which were much the same, but lo and behold, the dining room was graced with a German prisoner of war orchestra playing for the troops. But they dealt with a whole trainload of troops there in no time at all, and we were on our way. That, incidentally, was my first encounter with snow. We got out of the train in the dark. We stepped out into this snow, which was a new experience. It wasn't too long after that we moved from Florence across to Pisa and down through Rome. Remember, we had a breakfast stop and a shower stop at an unfinished Rome railway station, and on down to Naples. We had about a week, I think, in Naples, and as far as I remember, we were under canvas there. We had a trip out to Pompeii, and I'm not sure whether Mount Vesuvius, whether that was active at the time or not. It was probably smoking. But when I got back, I met a chap who was a lawyer who had been amongst the first troops into Naples with the Allied Military Government Organisation. And he was telling me how a chap who he met and was acting as a sort of liaison with kept assuring him that it wasn't deliberate on the Italians' part that Vesuvius had erupted. There was a quite significant eruption at the time. They hadn't done it, it just happened by itself, so that wasn't to be held against them. And we finally went aboard the Strathmore for our trip to Japan. I didn't mention the ship we sailed on from New Zealand was the Empress of Scotland. The Empress of Scotland started life as the Empress of Japan, but the events of December 1941 caused that name to be amended. The quarters on Strathmore, we were in a hold and lived in bunks, about 3 or 4 high, I think, all on a pipe framework. And, I'm not sure what the messing arrangements were, but I think from memory that somebody had to go and get them, collect rations from the central kitchen, and were served out to a particular little group amongst themselves. We called at Colombo again on the way through, but we weren't allowed ashore there because measles had broken out. And the same thing happened at Singapore, where the ship took on fuel, I suppose, and water. So we only saw Singapore as a series of islands from out in the sea. But the measles was quite serious, and quite a large number of people were put ashore there and put in hospital. And I suppose they tried to isolate it from the natives as best they could. We made another call at Hong Kong, which was just a blackened, smoking sort of ruin at that time. And finally we sailed up into the Sea of Japan, and Strathmore was led in by the battleship George V, and we were delighted to see some of our Air Force boys come down in F4Us and do some welcoming manoeuvres above us. We landed at the port of Kure, which is quite near Hiroshima, and we were put on the train and taken southwards to the city of Yamaguchi. On the way, of course, we went right through Hiroshima, and nobody seemed to think that there was any need to hurry or take any special precautions. And in my case, it appears that there weren't any. Yamaguchi had been occupied by American troops before our arrival, but our advance guard had been moving in, and they'd mucked up the water supply. And our first night there was no water available, but there was lots of Japanese beer, so there weren't too many complaints. And we moved into two-storied wooden barracks, which were very, very serious fire risks. So we had a series of knotted ropes that were to be thrown out of the upstairs windows and as our means of escape. And some of those buildings were, in fact, not in my time, but during the occupation period, some of those buildings were burned down. I think it had been an old police barracks, perhaps a training barracks, I don't know. Yamaguchi was a pretty small rural city. And we were more, as an engineer unit, we were concerned about improving quarters and communications, excuse me, and getting a hospital set up. And I was, at this time, was a D4 Caterpillar operator. with the mechanical equipment platoon of the a 5-engineer company of J-Force. Still part of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, but the division was no longer in existence. I guess our section's particular work was in roading, but we used a lot of local labour, and in particular to get gravel for improving the roads. The local people supplied labour from the local prisons, so we had these prisoners in a very primitive way hand shoveling all the metal through iron screens to get it sorted out into appropriate sizes. We found some abandoned Japanese built motor scoops that we could pull with the dozers, and it was interesting that they were shockingly roughly built, and you know, it was a menace to handle, and you're likely to get your hands ripped on rough gas cuts and welds and so on. Not really an indicator of the quality that they were able to turn out in Mazdas and Hondas, for example, in later years. There was evidence of bombing around Hiroshima, and later on they selected a group of us by competition, I think, who were to go to Tokyo, and we were to be part of the Commonwealth. We were part of a Commonwealth organisation, British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, and we were to relieve the Americans for a period in guarding the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and so on. We got all set up for this, and then in the finish they decided that our uniforms weren't good enough. That would be letting the side down to turn out in the gear that we had. So that was cancelled, but as a consolation they gave us a leave in Tokyo. And we went up by train, and it's an overnight journey. And the first thing that struck us on getting on the train was the impatience and the not in a disrespectful sort of way, but in a meaningful way of the Japanese wanted the train to be away exactly on time. This seemed to be a matter of national pride to run the train on time, to demonstrate that all wasn't lost. The train went mainly up the coast, but in a number of areas the railway diverted inland and around some sensitive military areas, and it soon became evident that the whole industrial potential along that coast of the inland sea had been completely destroyed by airstrikes, because in the finish the Americans were just able to operate at will through there, and it was pretty evident. But I mean, the atom bomb was the final cause of the surrender, but the underlying cause was, of course, that their industrial capacity had been absolutely shattered, and they were really down and out. And the Americans had moved in immediately, and they were organising dismantling of what machinery was left, and lots of things were being wrecked, lots of things were being dismantled and sent home in a series of parcels, of course. But by and large the whole place was wiped clean. It was an overnight journey, as I say, and the sight that greeted us in the morning was the sun on Mount Fujiyama, which was quite a sight. I don't remember much of Tokyo. I remember the Ginza and the series of underground shops and levels and shops that were there underneath the street. And the main services theatre was called the Ernie Pyle Theatre. Ernie Pyle was one of the big names amongst war correspondents. I think he was killed just before the end of the war. When we saw Tokyo, after passing through Hiroshima again, we wondered what all the fuss was about, because it seemed that the area at least of devastation in Tokyo was greater than Hiroshima. The reason for this was that there was a great deal of cottage industry in the suburbs of Tokyo, and the houses were generally of wooden construction, and with the incendiaries they made quite a job. There was also evidence of some pretty fine precision bombing. For example, I noticed in one area the naval headquarters had been flattened, and the adjoining buildings were still standing. Quite obviously they had deliberately maintained or kept the centre of Tokyo intact for the administration to take over. I don't know that I ever saw either the Emperor or General MacArthur, and I don't suppose either of them missed seeing me either. But we had about a week in Tokyo, as I remember, and then back to the sticks in Yamaguchi, and well, we had one or two posses where troops would go on leave, and of course as an engineer unit we had some motorboats, and these were stationed at these leave points. But I couldn't tell you now just exactly where these were. Our brigade headquarters and the Beekhoff headquarters were down at a place called Shimonoseki, which is quite a big port in the south of the island of Kyushu, I suppose. It's, well, whichever's the main island. I can't even remember that. And early July, I think we left for home. Our detachment was relieved in 2 drafts, and I was amongst the first. And I can tell you it was a memorable celebration when we left Yamaguchi. I nearly broke my leg getting aboard the troop ship. I think we had to go out on steel-decked lighters, or somehow we were moving across steel-decked lighters to get on the ship, all at night. And in the morning there was the most unearthly silence compared with the chatter of the night before. Anyway, we were aboard the P&O liner, the Chitral. Chitral, I understand, is an Indian bird. And as I remember, we had to travel with hammocks on that particular ship. Made only one call on the way down, and that was at Guam. But we didn't get ashore. They just refueled and I suppose took on some fresh fruit and stuff. And reached Auckland, I think, towards the end of July. The messing arrangements on ships varied a lot. I remember on the Empress of Scotland, which is pretty well organised, we sat at long tables, about perhaps 10 aside, so there'd be 20 men to one of those big army dixies. And it was always a problem as to know where to sit. If you sat at the end of the table, remote from where the dishing out started, on occasions you would have a mighty big helping. But conversely, on some occasions, things were a bit light by the time they got to you. So in balance, it was probably better to sit somewhere in the middle if you could. And I don't think that we had too much to complain about as far as feeding was concerned. I had a stripe on going over on the ship from Wellington to Egypt. And on one occasion I was put onto a detail cleaning up the officers' mess. Excuse me. And this detail was invariably for 4 nights. I'd say invariably until it came to my turn, and then it was made out for 5 nights. So we could only count to 4, and we didn't turn up on the 5th night. And that resulted in my appearing on charge in front of Selwyn Toogood, who I think I mentioned was the troop deck officer fortunately we had an old player from the Carmo Rugby Football Club, the club captain, who was a WO1, and he was able to feed me up with some suggested defences, and I just finished up with being admonished. But I could quite well imagine the consternation that was caused amongst the Pommy crew members when their detail didn't turn up. Anyway, that was on the outward journey, and now we're going home. And the first thing we saw of New Zealand on the return was the top of Mount Egmont. Had no idea how familiar that site would become at the time. And we sailed down to Lyttelton and discharged the South Island contingent there, and then they waited, gave us a leave for the rest of the day, and then the ship sailed in the evening, and we arrived back in Wellington in the morning. And we were messed around all day, and our train travelled up overnight to Auckland, and there Dad met me, and I think he was down there for a football match. He was the president of the rugby union in Whangarei. And I got a ride home by car from there. So, wasn't long before we were given a final medical boarding, and I think given some money to buy civilian clothes, which after years of accepting army khaki, having to make decisions on clothing became a bit of a chore. And I worked for about 6 months, I suppose, in the Public Works Department in Whangarei. And then I took Mother on when we were demobilised, we got a free rail pass for ourselves and one dependent. So remembering Mum's attention to me when I'd been sick, I went with her on a trip to the South Island, and we went as far down, well, we went right down to Bluff. I can't imagine that we saw anything of the west coast, although we did go to Nelson because Mum had a cousin there. Then I was with Mum when she had her first flight, and that was across Cook Strait, because we couldn't get on the ship from Nelson, I think it was. Anyhow, we went across in a DH Rapide, I think, and it was bouncing away like anything, and it was a fairly small cabin. I looked round to see how Mum was doing, and she was grinning away and quite enjoying it. But we landed at Paraparaumu and we had to go back to Wellington. And on the way back, I remember, broke off and went across to Tauranga, and there we got engaged. Of course, question was what to do about a career, and it was quite plain that all the universities were full of people who had better claims to it than we, people who had were in the last reinforcements, and so we had to settle for taking the exams of mainly of the English institution, the civil engineers. But of course, the thing was to find a job where you could get appropriate training to be accepted to sit these examinations. I had applied for a job with the Poverty Bay Catchment Board, which thankfully I didn't get. And finished up with a job finished up with two jobs, as a matter of fact, a job with the Tauranga County and a job with Manawatu Catchment Board. And we chose to go to Manawatu, and so very nearly didn't get the opportunity to take that job because the letter requesting us to come for an interview had been sent not to Whangarei but to Wanganui. And they wondered why I hadn't turned up. Anyway, we went down, and Jill came down with me, and we had a look, and we discovered that eventually it was I started there, and then it was settled that I should go and live after I got married, that we should go and live at Paeatua and establish an office over there. So we were married on August the 23rd in 1947. So the arithmetic's right for the 45 years, and we honeymooned on Mount Egmont, and we got snowed in there, and so we weren't able to make a trip up to New Plymouth as we had thought would be nice, but consoled ourselves as we rode out snowbound and rode out in the rubbish truck with the thought, well, no doubt we'll have another opportunity to see New Plymouth. And after finishing out my required period of training, which incidentally was organised under a rehabilitation scheme that they had for ex-servicemen. My pay was subsidised by government, and it was a whole £5 a week to start with. So Jill had to take a job selling haberdashery at the local farmers, Wairarapa Farmers Co-op. John was born, we lived in an upstairs flat, and when John was born we became eligible for a state house. The state house we moved into had big deep drains running by it, so it wasn't particularly successful. Anyway, I think we had hens there, didn't we? We run some chickens out in the yard. Anyway, the required period of training was finishing up, so we thought we'd look for a job further north. Paeatua wasn't really an ideal place to be in when you were studying, mainly by correspondence. But after work, I would be sent off into the dining room and told to get on with my study while Mum did the dishes. Incidentally, I well remember hiring the first chainman there. He sat in the chair while I had to sit on the floor to hire him. And of course, he started off at a considerably higher pay than I was getting. Eventually we applied for a job in New Plymouth that seemed to fit the stage of my career, and so we saw Christine safely into the world, and next day set off in a borrowed car to go to New Plymouth for an interview about this job. And it was very convenient that an icebreaker, when I went in for the interview and somebody said, "Oh, you're married with one child," and I said, "Nope, make that two." So that was a very convenient icebreaker. And of course there were the usual questions that were asked those days. "Oh, I see you were in an engineer unit in the army. Did you know Major Malt? Did you know so-and-so?" Anyway, they offered me the job, and the boss, Ray Mainland, said, "I'll take you in the car and just show you around a bit." And he said, "And here's Pukekura Park." And I looked blankly, and I'm sure he wondered what sort of an idiot he'd just hired. And when I thought about it, I remembered, of course, that Pukekura Park used to feature very often on railways posters that were put up as publicity. I think I better stop now. had to give 3 months' notice before we could leave the Manawatu Catchment Board to go to New Plymouth. So seems logical to me to go back and say a few things about Pahiatua. The headquarters of the Manawatu Catchment Board were in Palmerston North, and the Manawatu River ran through the city. It reached the west coast about 25 miles away at Foxton, perhaps a little closer, but some very rich farmland was subject to flooding downstream. In fact, the whole area, including the city, was subject to flooding. About 12 miles north, the Manawatu River came through a pretty steep, deep gorge and opened out again on the other side of the ranges into some flat alluvial areas that had all manner of problems related with rivers. And it seemed a sensible move to have somebody in Pahiatua, because one of the first jobs we had to do was to strengthen the system of flood warnings for the lower Manawatu and particularly Palmerston North City. The catchment was quite extensive. I suppose it would have been 50 miles north and south, and perhaps 20-25 miles wide towards the east coast. I remember Archdeacon Young, our vicar in Pahiatua, explaining to a visiting bishop that Pahiatua meant the dwelling place of the gods. And he commented, from there they reign over us. So a combination of ample rainfall and rich alluvial soils, an ideal area for dairying. And in fact, one of the big names in cheese in New Zealand, Tararua, applies to a product from a factory quite close to Pahiatua. In the higher countries, there was quite a bit of sheep farming. Because of the general shape of the catchment, there could be some very interesting situations as to concentration of the runoff. So while the predecessor of the catchment board, the Manawatu River Board, had a gauging station at the far end of the gorge. It was highly desirable that the coverage be beefed up. So we spent quite a bit of time marking out gauging stations and tearing out whenever it rained to essentially to get the velocities of the stream for various stages of flooding. We would measure off several hundred feet of a reach, measure off markers on each bank, and simply time debris going by. We had no equipment at all. For a lot of the time, my transport was an old Model A Tourer, and I remember my hands used to be quite red from the steering wheel, which was disintegrating in my hands. We had some interesting situations going along these dark riverbanks. And anyway, the data that we accumulated, these were used to improve the level of sophistication of the flood forecasting, and eventually, of course, everything was done with current meters. We had to, of course, survey cross sections of the river, but later on they had current meters and this whole system and recording gauges, and the system was gradually built up over the years and provided some interesting information. Besides that, the main job was to prepare plans for work on the Mangatonoka River, which was a tributary which ran on the border of the town of Pahiatua, and these were braided shingle rivers, and it was proposed to confine the river as far as possible to a narrower channel, and to plant up the banks with willows, and gradually restore some of the areas that have been eroded, and they would still be available as a floodplain, but would provide rough grazing for most of the year. Pahiatua was quite a small town. I think perhaps only a couple of thousand people. It was the sort of town where one of the perks of being mayor was getting to drive the mower, drive the tractor, but pull the mower to keep the recreation ground in order. Still, we had quite a lot of fun there. My office was with the Public Works Department, or Ministry of Works as it had become by then. They had a depot and office in the Polish camp. This was a camp that had been established on the old racecourse at Pahiatua for the reception of Polish children who had been displaced from Eastern Europe. Had quite an adventure and came out, and they were raised there in Pahiatua. Had its own nursing staff within the hospital, school staff. Basically, the camp was run by the army with the assistance of various government departments, including Ministry of Works. The camp was commanded by a major. They told the story in Ministry of Works about the plumber making last-minute connections in the dark so the major and his family could move in. And with some glee they told of the major's lady flushing the toilet and jumping clear of hot water. Well, it just so happened that finally the major was cashiered for putting his fingers in the till, so he was obviously in hot water at both ends of his stay in Pahiatua. Well, eventually our 3 months leave was up, and we loaded our gear onto a railway wagon. We travelled to Palmerston North with John and Chris and the cat. We checked with somebody in Airways Corporation that cats were permitted in aircraft. And when we got to the airport, the story was a little bit different. However, the suggestion was that we take it aboard without saying anything to the captain, and we we finally got to New Plymouth. I'm not sure that we didn't land at Wanganui on the way. It was a real cream run. We were in DC-3's ex-military aircraft that had been taken over by the newly formed National Airways Corporation, and they provided for many years a very good service for the locals. I thought of something, John, your first flight was from Tauranga to Auckland on a Lodestar, I think it was, and then from Auckland to Whangarei on another NAC plane, and my old classmate Kevin George was flying the aircraft, and he beckoned me up to the cockpit. So I sat on the wing spar which passed through the cabin directly behind the driver, and we chatted about this and that on the way. And I mentioned to him that I'd helped the Ministry of Works in Paeatua in setting out a navigation beacon somewhere near Paeatua, and he promptly said, "Oh, I'll show you how these things work." So he lurched the aircraft to the left and gave me a set of headphones, and the signal changed, of course, when we were at the edge of the beam. And then his right hand down, and away we went to the other side, and it was quite a happy reunion and a very pleasant flight. I remember when we landed at Whangarei, I introduced him to Mum, and he said, and introduced him to John, who was in a carry cot. And he said, firstly, "How old is John?" And then he said, "How long have you been married?" And it struck me that that's not quite the sort of thing that the airline expects of its captain. So we arrived on the airfield, grass strip at New Plymouth. It had been an Air Force field during the war. The huts were at that time still in service as residential units because there was a very great shortage of housing units, because of the lack of any residential building during the war, and secondly because of the large numbers of marriages that took place immediately after the war. I forgot to mention, when we got to Paeatua, we presented our certificate of entitlement for a pair of blankets. Having been in the services, we were entitled to a pair of blankets. I don't know how people who hadn't been in the services got on. Anyway, we got our blankets, but we had very little else, so we didn't have a great deal of gear to shift up to New Plymouth. We were met at the airport by Ray Main, the boss, and he was able to come right out to the aircraft and see us down the steps. So we passed him Christine in her carry cot. John at that stage had grown beyond the carry cot stage. We passed Chris to the boss and said, "Hang on, I'll go back and get the cat. And I told you previously that I'm sure he wondered what on earth he had hired, and I'm sure he wondered again what he'd hired. However, we collected everything and everybody together, and he took us into the council house that we were to occupy. Our luggage was, our furniture was being unloaded, and we set together to set to work to make our home, which we occupied there for about 12 or 14 years. Well, it wasn't long before the Rush children came across with a message of support, and Mr. Hoffey arrived with another message of support and news of a warm airing cupboard to dry out any washing that needed to be taken care of. And I think, oh, and then Jill got on the bicycle, means of transport, and rode down to the store, which was run by the Lester family. A lot of warm welcome down there. So we thought this was great. Next morning I got up and went outside, and there was in the letterbox was a bottle of milk and a newspaper. And I thought, well, really, this is just too much hospitality. Took them inside, and a short while later there was a knock on the door, and we were asked, oh, did you happen to get our milk and paper out of the box? This was a drop-off point for the people who worked in a council facility just across the road from us. I remember the next day, Jill's folks arrived from Tauranga to give us a hand to get settled in, and their help was very much appreciated. New Plymouth at that time was very much a cow town. The volcanic soils and ample rainfall and the fertility generally made it a reasonably easy area for dairy farming, although the country tended to be quite broken once you got away from the coast. But there was a dairy factory every mile or so, although there had been that sort of intensity. I suppose really they started off at sledge distance apart, and then when the farmers could afford drays, they could move the milk. And it was milk because most of the product was cheese originally. They could move that more easily, and gradually, as a means of transport and roading improved, the dairy factories consolidated a bit until now there are only 2 dairy factories in the whole of Taranaki, and they are transporting milk very long distances with tankers. But it was New Plymouth had the advantage of having a port. The remnants of a volcano, and there was a southward movement of volcanic peaks across the area, but the oldest remnants provided a flank for the construction of a breakwater. There was also an attempt to win rock filling from Paratutu, a peak about 750 feet, I suppose. But thankfully that was unsuccessful, and Paratutu is still there as one of the major features on the coast. The war effects were still being felt very strongly, quite apart from this transit housing that had to be provided. All public works had been suspended, or most of them had been suspended during the war, so there were accumulations of work and maintenance requiring to be done. The council were a very steady as you go bunch. Weren't at all keen to spend money on fancy trimmings, and the town clerk, who was about to achieve 50 years as a town clerk, had a goal of leaving a debt-free city when he... Having said that, I have to say that the reason I was hired was to help prepare a program of loanworks. But my very first job in New Plymouth was to set out some lamps on Churchill Heights, above the hospital in New Plymouth. But we worked away diligently at some very fundamental things like roadworks and sewer lines and alterations to the water supply and various other things connected with municipal engineering. Testing station, vehicle testing station. Designed that, and for a while acted as understudy to the deputy city engineer, who's unfortunately suffered from heart complaint, and on his death I was appointed assistant city engineer. Now Tauranga, New Plymouth had just recently become a city, so that its population had reached 20,000. So willy-nilly it had to have X number of councillors, so it had to build itself a new council chamber, and incorporated in that was a new mess room. Prior to that, the conditions were very, very primitive indeed. Council operations were quite extensive. It had a tramway system until 1955, I think that was closed down. But some of the tram lines have been closed down a little earlier, and they had not cable cars, trolley buses on those routes. And there was a fascinating gadget down in the basement of the electricity department converting the electricity for use by these things. Lovely big glowing tubes. Anyway, we pressed on, and eventually, the deputy city engineer was allowed to go off to the occasional conference, and one memorable year we took the children and went right away down through the tour of the South Island, right down as far as Invercargill, I think. And the conference was in Dunedin, and we went to the reception there associated with the conference, and we bought Mum a new dress and the fur stole, and she swanked into a fish and chip shop and bought fish and chips. We took it home to our living quarters in the stables on the showground. The dress she subsequently wore to an engineer's party in New Plymouth, and we were comfortably installed when we became the boss. There was Mrs. Mainland, who was wearing, you guessed it, exactly the same dress. The city engineer, Ray Mainland. Oh, sorry, I should have. Also had a heart problem, and I acted in his place, although I had to cart everything around to his bedside. Anyway, that was all a good experience, and in 1961 both he and the town clerk of the day, the town clerk had only had a fairly short term in office. He'd grown old during the reign of the 50-year town clerk. Anyway, they both retired at the same time, and the deputy town clerk was appointed town clerk, and I was appointed city engineer, and took up that job in 1st of July in 1961. And my service with the council as city engineer finished in November, August of 1983, although I was on leave for that 6 months retiring leave and some sick leave that had accrued to me. So we went there in 1950 and retired finally in 1983, so that was almost 33 years with New Plymouth City, a fair chunk out of a lifetime. I remember thinking when we hadn't been there too long, and weren't terribly impressed with the job for a start. But remember thinking, well, now we're here, we'll have to stay at least 3 years, or we'll get a reputation as being unstable and wanderers and that sort of thing. Anyway, it all worked out pretty good. I'd sat my last exam paper in just before coming up to New Plymouth, and the following year, having passed that, I had to go for third part of the examinations, which was essentially a professional interview, followed by a 3-hour written paper. And I don't know how other chaps got on, but in my experience the written paper was simply a test. It was really an essay that was really meant to test that you knew that the work, the plans and specifications and design material that we had to submit as part of the examination, you had to prove that we in fact had done the work and that we knew what we were talking about. The question was phrased very nicely from my point of view, and was no trouble at all, and in due course passed the examination and became eligible for registration as an engineer under the New Zealand Engineers Registration Act. So I filled in my application form, and it had to be signed in front of a Justice of the Peace. Now, mayors, by virtue of their office, are Justices of the Peace. And I'd never met our mayor. It seems strange in retrospect, but that's the way things were in the first couple of years I was there. Juniors were kept very much in their place. So I went in to see him and asked if he would mind signing this document for me. He flipped it open. He read no further than the word registration, and he said, "Oh, another stud jersey, is it?" So as you see, 2 years later, it was still very much a cow town. I'd no sooner taken up the job of city engineer and things started to happen. I know the council had its power generation station was subject to a landslip, and that was knocked about a bit. We had a very severe flood, and that was one of the problems that was to dog us through that period that I was there. Something else that tested this. Oh, I know, the reservoir, the water reservoir. The outlet became jammed, and the water level rose a bit, and it was a very old. It was really just an earth lining, a concrete lining to a hole in the ground, and that split open. And this thing was really acted as a brake pressure tank between the point of picking up the water and the delivery to the city. So we had to man our chlorination plant. We were able to pass the water through that at a very restricted rate, and hence at an acceptable pressure level. But that machine had to be driven manually for some weeks until we had repairs done. As a result of that flood, I recommended to the council that it get somebody in who really knew what they were about as far as flooding was concerned. And so that was done rather reluctantly. A program of investigation and really accumulation of data that would enable proper flood forecasts to be made. That was set up, but it was pretty obvious that the council would depend on assistance from subsidies that were available for the purpose, but that we wouldn't get a subsidy until government was really good and ready. Well, then a further complication arose when they formed a catchment commission, which was based on Stratford. Now, it was interesting that when we first went to New Plymouth, although New Plymouth had attained city status, Stratford, which housed had housed the Public Works Department since the days of railway construction, the Ministry of Works was somewhat reluctantly moved to New Plymouth, mainly because the engineer at the time had bought a house in New Plymouth. Howrah, too, was still sturdily independent, as was every little hamlet in Taranaki. The only thing they got united over was the Taranaki provincial rugby team. And later on, when the National Roads Board system was set up, when it was a battle for funds, it was amazing to see how this diverse agglomeration of local authorities managed to sort out priorities and present a united front if it came to an argument with Wellington. Lost my thread. The situation, of course, changed later on, particularly when the oil exploration really got going out of New Plymouth, and lots of engineers flooded in, and now the meetings are held in New Plymouth, and if you don't like to come to New Plymouth, you don't go to a meeting. New Plymouth had oil wells for a very, very long time indeed. And in fact, they were rather lucky that the oil wells was producing during the war, and there was a very primitive little refinery, and that the council had a deal with the oil company about taking its output, diesel oil and petrol, and that went on for some time until a consortium of Shell, BP and a New Zealand company, Todd Oil Industries, moved in, and they bought out the local company. In the meantime, there had been interest in the gas that was available from these oil wells. New Plymouth had a coal plant producing gas from coal that was taken over by the city in about 1960, and the plant a new plant was built, and they shortly afterwards they piped up gas from the oil wells at Naumudu Beach, and they blended about 15%, I think, of the natural gas with the coal gas. That was about as much as they could feed in without having to change the burners. In 1958, I think, the Kapuni field was discovered and developed, and gas lines were built through New Plymouth to the north, and another one ran southwards, and there was a condensate line for the oil component was the delivery to the city. So we had to man our chlorination plant. We were able to pass the water through that at a very restricted rate, and hence at an acceptable pressure level. But that machine had to be driven manually for some weeks until we had repairs done. As a result of that flood, I recommended to the council that it get somebody in who really knew what they were about as far as flooding was concerned. So that was done rather reluctantly. A program of investigation and really accumulation of data that would enable proper flood forecasts to be made. That was set up, but it was pretty obvious that the council would depend on assistance from subsidies that were available for the purpose, but that we wouldn't get a subsidy until government was really good and ready. Well, then a further complication arose when they formed a catchment commission, which was based on Stratford. Now, it was interesting that when we first went to New Plymouth, although New Plymouth had attained city status, Stratford, which housed had housed the Public Works Department since the days of railway construction, the Ministry of Works was somewhat reluctantly moved to New Plymouth, mainly because the engineer at the time had bought a house in New Plymouth. Hawera, too, was still sturdily independent, as was every little hamlet in Taranaki. The only thing they got united over was the Taranaki provincial rugby team. And later on, when the National Roads Board system was set up, when it was a battle for funds, it was amazing to see how this diverse agglomeration of local authorities managed to sort out priorities and present a united front if it came to an argument with Wellington. Lost my thread. the situation, of course, changed later on, particularly when the oil exploration really got going out of New Plymouth, and lots of engineers flooded in, and now the meetings are held in New Plymouth, and if you don't like to come to New Plymouth, you don't go to a meeting. New Plymouth had oil wells for a very, very long time indeed. And in fact, they were rather lucky that the oil wells was producing during the war, and there was a very primitive little refinery, and that the council had a deal with the oil company about taking its output, diesel oil and petrol, and that went on for some time until a consortium of Shell, BP and a New Zealand company, Todd Oil Industries, moved in, and they bought out the local company. In the meantime, there had been interest in the gas that was available from these oil wells. New Plymouth had a coal plant producing gas from coal that was taken over by the city in about 1960, and the plant a new plant was built, and they shortly afterwards they piped up gas from the oil wells at Naumudu Beach, and they blended about 15%, I think, of the natural gas with the coal gas. That was about as much as they could feed in without having to change the burners. In 1958, I think, the Kapuni field was discovered and developed, and gas lines were built through New Plymouth to the north, and another one ran southwards, and there was a condensate line for the oil component was brought up to the port. During this period, the